to introduce CCLP's Executive Director, Tiffany Lennon. Tiffany joined us in 2019 and has led the development and implementation of a new strategic plan and helped us to revise our mission, vision, and values. Under her leadership, CCLP is strengthening its commitment to racial equity, community outreach, and inclusion. And you can read more about her on our website at cclponline.org. And with that, I'll turn over the virtual podium to Tiffany, who will say a few words and introduce Charlie. Hi, Tiffany.
Hi, Bob. Thanks so much for your introduction. As Bob mentioned, I'm Tiffany Lennon, the Executive Director of the Colorado Center on Law and Policy, and I'd like to welcome you to the official launch of the State of Working Colorado. What you can expect from the 2020 report is a deeper dive into demographic and geographic data. What you will learn is that the racial and gender disparities persist, as does the rural and urban divide. One of the more interesting aspects of the report is that CCLP's data collection was near complete, and then COVID-19 struck. On the one hand, COVID turned the relevancy of our data on its head. But on the other hand, having a baseline of pre-COVID data in hand gave CCLP a head start in understanding the consequences and impact of the pandemic. We delayed the release of the State of Working Colorado to ensure that we could capture an accurate COVID picture for Colorado. It is important to keep in mind that even if business returned to normal, even if employment opportunities were at pre-COVID levels, many, if not most, Coloradans would still struggle to provide nutritious food, stable housing, and healthcare because their incomes are simply insufficient. The widening income and wealth gaps were present before COVID and will continue to be present after COVID. COVID just highlighted the gross disparities even more. It's not enough to return to normal. We must act to build an equitable economy where Coloradans have what they need. CCLP's Deputy Director of Research, Charlie Brennan, will lay out the State of Working Colorado. And in subsequent months, CCLP will release a series of white papers designed to put forward policy and legal solutions regarding food, health, housing, and income. It is imperative that we work together on a series of solutions. For example, minimum and low wage jobs make up a large part of our economy. Most argue that our economy depends on these minimum and low wage jobs. Therefore, we need to be bold in putting forward solutions that will allow people to have their basic needs met. Even if or when these jobs return, it will not be sufficient. Supplemental income will be a necessary component. And it is solutions like these that we are seeking to put forward in the upcoming white paper series. So with this, I will turn over the rest of this presentation to Charlie Brennan so that he could further explain and disaggregate data as it pertains to the State of Working Colorado. Charlie has been part of our research team for a couple of years now, and he is a trusted valued member of the CCLP team. You can guarantee that what Charlie presents has been thoroughly vetted and comprehensively analyzed. So with that, Charlie.
Thank you, Tiffany. Thanks for that introduction. Again, thank you all for being with us. We're all pleased to have you here with us today and to be able to share our findings from the State of Working Colorado report with all of you. So before we dive into the findings, I just wanted to give a sort of a brief overview of the report. Tiffany touched on it a little bit in her introduction. So CCLP has published a State of Working Colorado report regularly for a number of years. This report traditionally has looked at a range of economic and workforce indicators in our state. This new edition, as Tiffany mentioned, will take a deeper dive and takes a deeper dive into more detailed disaggregations of some of the statewide statistics and trends that were captured in previous reports. We've also included more geographical data so that we can understand better and learn how our economy is working differently in different parts of our state. While the bulk of the data and analysis in the report itself is from 2018, as Tiffany mentioned, we felt it was important to include as much data as possible from the post-COVID-19 period so that we could see how our economy has changed over the past year. As you would expect, the story about Colorado told by data from 2018 is very different than the situation in which we currently find ourselves. While not as much data is available to help us understand these recent changes, we've included as much as we can. Our report covers a lot of ground and more than we have time to go over today. Since I have a feeling most of you will be tuning in are especially interested in the 2020 data, we'll only touch on some of our key takeaways from 2018. There's a lot more in this report, and so I hope you'll take a look at what we've put together. While the 2018 data may seem irrelevant given today's economy is very different from the one that we experienced 2 years ago, it's important for us to still be able to understand how our economy functioned in the past, because this is the economy that we will return to if we return to normal. In other words, unless we use this latest economic crisis as an opportunity to reimagine and reshape our state's economy, many of the trends and forces present back in 2018 will likely return. So it is still important for us to understand how our economy was working so that we can ensure it does not work that way in the future. Prior to 2020, Colorado had a booming economy. Gross domestic product, or GDP, is one of the most common metrics for evaluating an economy and its strength. According to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, Colorado had the 16th largest economy in the country as measured by GDP. The state's GDP represented 18% of total US economic output in 2018. In addition, our economy grew at the 6th fastest annual rate since the end of the Great Recession. As we can see from the chart, Colorado's year-to-year GDP growth outpaced that of the country as a whole from 2013 to 2018. Despite this rosy picture of the state's economy, not every part of our state was experiencing economic growth. In fact, around 18 counties saw their GDP decline between 2017 and 2018. Although the majority of Colorado's economic output came from counties along the Front Range, these were not the fastest growing counties in the state. In all, Washington County experienced the greatest rate of GDP growth at 20.8%. On the other hand, Kiowa County saw its GDP decline by 18.6% between 2017 and 2018. As we can see on the map in the red areas on the map, these counties were all counties that lost GDP over the past, between 2017 and 2018. It suggests that many parts of our states were already experiencing conditions that could be conditions that we would expect to see during economic downturns, even before this current recession that we're in. So before we dive into more detailed data on the economy, let's first turn to who is in our labor force. Labor force is a technical term used by economists to describe Coloradans 16 years and older who are employed or unemployed but looking for work. In other words, these are Coloradans who are actively participating in the labor market. Our labor force in 2018 was different from the past in a number of key ways. Looking at age specifically, we find that our labor force is getting older. 22.2% of those in the labor force in 2018 were 55 years or older, nearly double the share in 1990. At the same time, our labor force has become more racially and ethnically diverse. Non-white Coloradans made up approximately 30% of our labor force in 2018, nearly double their share in 1990. Colorado's labor force also continues to become more educated. Nearly half of all those in the workforce had a bachelor's degree or higher in 2018. At the same time, the share of Coloradans in the labor force with less than a high school education declined by just 3 percentage points. So that's a brief overview of the labor force. Now let's turn to the first group of Coloradans who make up our labor force, employed Coloradans. We can see from this chart that non-farm jobs have more than recovered from the losses that we experienced during and following the Great Recession. We returned to our pre-recession level of employment sometime in 2014 and have continued to see job growth over the following 4 years. One interesting trend you can see from this chart is that employment losses tended to continue even after the official end of the recession. the economy did not begin to add jobs until a few months after. This was true for both the 2001 and the Great Recession, which are noted on the chart in the pink shaded areas. The government sector of our economy employed the most Coloradans in 2018. It was followed by healthcare and social assistance, accommodation and food services, and the retail trade sectors. Together, these four sectors accounted for nearly half of all employment in Colorado. These sectors were also the ones that grew the most following the Great Recession. Of the nearly 500,000 jobs that we added to our economy between 2010 and 2018, 43% were in these four sectors alone. Geographically, the majority of Colorado's jobs were located in urban counties. In total, just 12.2% of all jobs were found in rural counties in 2018. In terms of job growth, rates of growth varied county by county. Not all counties experienced employment growth between 2010 and 2018. We can see the red counties on the map actually had lower levels of employment in 2018 than they did after the recession. Of all the jobs added over this period, 63.2% were located in the Denver metro region, highlighting the important role that this region plays in our state economy and as a driver of economic growth in our state. Despite our strong economy, there were still unemployed Coloradans in the state. While Colorado's unemployment rate was lower in 2018 than it was for the United States, both in 2018 and for nearly the past 30 years, they both tend to follow the same trends, rising and falling together. In 2018, the unemployment rate was at 3.3% in Colorado. While this was slightly higher than the previous year, it is still at levels that we have not seen in our state since the 1990s or early 2000s. As with job growth, unemployment rates also varied across Colorado's 64 counties. In 2018, rates were lowest in the eastern part of the state and highest in the south and south central parts of the state. Huerfano County had the highest unemployment rate in Colorado at 6.4%. On the other hand, Cheyenne County had the lowest rate of unemployment at 1.8%. How did our state's strong economy affect the economic security of workers? One way to answer this question is to look at the wages and income earned by Coloradans over this period. Here we can see that for controlling for inflation, the median wage in Colorado remained virtually unchanged over the past 18 years. In 2018, half of Colorado's workforce earned an hourly wage less than $20.37 an hour, while half earned more than this. That's the definition of a median. This was an increase of just 29 cents from 2000. In other words, despite our state's strong economic growth, wages for many workers have remained more or less unchanged for nearly 2 decades. However, this was not the case for all wage earners. Here we see wages from 2000 and 2018 for different percentiles of workers in Colorado. A percentile is similar to the median in that it represents the wage at which a certain share of workers earned more than and a certain share earned less than. For example, at the 10th percentile, at that wage level, 10% of Colorado's workers earned less than $10.99 per hour in 2018, while 90% earned more. Same is true of the 80th percentile. In 2018, 80% of our workforce earned less than $37.03 an hour, and 20% earned more. We can see that for most percentiles, wage increases were only about $1 per hour or less between 2000 and 2018 when we control for inflation. The greatest increases were seen among those at the upper end of the wage spectrum, particularly the top 10% of earners who saw their wages increase by about $10 an hour. Although wages at the bottom of the wage spectrum did experience growth, which was most likely due to the increases in the minimum wage in our state, it was still not enough to counter the much higher rates of growth seen amongst top wage earners. As a result, the gap between the top 10% and bottom 10% of earners increased since 2000. Although the size of this gap does vary year to year, there has been a clear trend towards growth, as illustrated by the blue dashed line, which is the trend line on the chart. In 2000, this gap was $31.84 per hour, but by 2018, it had grown almost $10 higher to $40.19 per hour. Wage gaps also exist when we look at different demographic groups in our state. As we can see here from the median wages for different groups for 2018, men tended to earn more than women in our state, white workers earned more at the median than workers of color, and workers with a bachelor's degree earned the most at the median of any group in our state at $28.64 per hour. This was above the statewide rate of $20.37 an hour. Workers' wages also varied by the sectors that they were employed in. At the top of the spectrum, workers in the management of companies and enterprises sector, which employed just 1.5% of Colorado's workforce in 2018, earned an average weekly wage of $2,616. At $451 per week, the average worker in the accommodation and food services sector earned the least of all sectors in the state. And if we think back and look or remember back to the top sectors by employment in our state, so retail trade, accommodation and food services, government, and healthcare and social assistance, in each one of these sectors, the average worker actually earned less than the statewide average of $1,133 in 2018. In 2018, Colorado's household income was $96,218, which means that if all of the $209.4 billion of income that was earned in our state in 2018 was distributed equally to all households, each household would have received $96,000 that year. I say this to make the point that ending poverty is not a question of resources. We have enough income for everyone to earn more than enough to cover their basic needs in our state. Instead, it's a question of how these resources are distributed versus how they should be distributed. This chart shows how income actually was distributed among households in 2018. As we can see, just 3.5% of the total income earned in our state went to the poorest 20% of households. At the same time, the richest 5% of households earned 21.6% of the total income in our state. Increasing income inequality is even more apparent when we look at the share of income captured by the top 1% of earners over time. The chart shows us that the share of income going to the top 1% has been increasing since the end of the 1970s, after decreasing over the previous 4 decades. By 2015, income inequality reached levels we have not seen in our state for at least 100 years. Between 1973 and 2007, the top 1% of Coloradans captured 50% of the wage growth that occurred in our state over that period. Income is important. It allows many households not only to be able to pay for their basic needs, but also to save money and build up their own personal safety net on which they can draw in case of emergencies. Wealth, or net worth as it's also known, is the sum of a household's assets, so things they can accumulate and purchase with their income in most cases. So these include things like homes, stocks and bonds, saving accounts, cars, etc. So net worth is assets minus liabilities. Liabilities include credit card debts, mortgages, student loans, and so forth. The median net worth of a household in Colorado, or the median wealth, was much higher than that for households in the United States as a whole. And this was both over from 2013 and through 2016. And the median weight has been trending upwards despite a small decrease between 2015 and 2016. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of good state level data available to help us accurately understand how net worth is distributed across households in Colorado, either geographically, by different wealth percentiles, or by races or ethnicities. However, there are some statistics we can turn to for clues as to how wealth is distributed in our state. In 2016, we know that 12.5% of households in the state had no net worth, so no wealth at all, or at least wealth or liabilities exceeded assets that year. This was compared to 21.9% of households of color in our state. This means that 1 in 5 households of color in Colorado had no safety net or savings of any kind that they could use to support themselves. For instance, if they lost their source of income, as happened to many households in Colorado over the past year, they would have no savings on which to draw upon. On the other hand, less than 1 in 10 white households had no net worth in 2016. If wealth is a measure of material well-being, then poverty is the opposite. We can see that there are big gaps in the poverty rate and near poverty rate for white households and households of color in our state. Nearly half of all Black and African American and American Indian and Alaska Native households experienced poverty or were near poverty in 2018, compared to just 1 in 5 white households. Despite these different rates, white Coloradans made up the largest share of those experiencing poverty in 2018. Although it was a disproportionately smaller share than we would expect given their overall share of the population as a whole. Rates of poverty also varied geographically across Colorado. In 2018, Douglas County experienced the lowest rate of poverty in the state at 3.5%. On the other hand, 30.1% of Coloradans living in Costilla County experienced poverty that same year. Poverty rates were highest in rural parts of the state, particularly in southeastern Colorado. In 2018, 13.1% of rural Coloradans experienced poverty, compared to just 10.6% for urban Coloradans. The official poverty measure, as it's known in the United States, is the official way, or the metric that's used to measure poverty and income inadequacy in the United States and Colorado. However, We at CCLP like to use a more comprehensive measure that's known as the Self-Sufficiency Standard. This is a measure that was developed by a professor at the University of Washington, and unlike poverty, is based on all major budget items that are faced by working adults in our state. This includes costs for housing, healthcare, childcare, clothing, food, transportation, and other resources. These costs are based on, for the self-sufficiency standard, the way that it's calculated, they're based based on county-specific data. And that's so that they can reflect differing costs of living across Colorado, something that the poverty rate does not do. And these are adjusted by a family's composition and size. In 2016, 8.4% of households in Colorado were below the official poverty threshold. This was compared to 27.4% who were below the self-sufficiency standard, meaning that despite not being in poverty, over 300,000 households in our state were unable to meet their basic needs using their income alone. This also marks an increase from 2000, when just 20% of households in Colorado were below the self-sufficiency standard. The share of households below self-sufficiency also varies by race and ethnicity. Close to half of all Hispanic and Latinx and Black and African American households in our state did not receive enough income to cover their essential expenses, much more than the statewide share. On the other hand, 21.5% of white households were below the standard. Also, if you notice, the gap between the share of households below self-sufficiency and below the official poverty measure was greatest for Hispanic, Latinx, and Black and African American households. This suggests that the poverty rate is not great at accurately estimating the income needs for households of color as it is for other groups of households in the state. So that's all for our section on Colorado before COVID-19, or in the period leading up to 2018. As I mentioned at the outset, there's a lot more data that you can find in the report, and so I encourage you to look back and do so. Before we move on to the next segment of our presentation, which is focusing on Colorado after COVID-19, or the experience of Colorado during 2020, I'd like to go over a few key takeaways that I got when I was doing this research and examining the data from 2018. First, the recovery from the Great Recession has been uneven. While we've recovered overall as a state, there are still parts of our state that are struggling, and there are still different sectors that have not yet recovered all of the employment that they lost during the Great Recession, even 10 years after the beginning of this event. This reminds us that the labor market is much more complex than headline statistics like the unemployment rate would suggest, particularly when we're only looking at these statistics for the statewide. When you disaggregate different measures like unemployment rate by different races and ethnic groups, educational attainments, different geographic locations in our state, we begin to see a different story than that told by the headline. At the same time, racial and ethnic disparities exist across nearly all of the labor market statistics that are examined in this report. And many cannot be fully explained by visible characteristics that we might expect to affect someone's employment, for example, such as their educational attainments, their work experience, et cetera. Many of these disparities can be linked back to historic and ongoing histories of racial oppression and segregation and discrimination in our state and country. While inequities exist within different groups in our state, inequality also exists both across groups and within groups in Colorado. This is true particularly when we look at wages. So even though there's an overall gap between the lowest paid workers in our state and the highest paid workers in our state, these gaps exist when we examine the trends for different groups within our state, such as different racial groups or different genders. And as we just saw on the last slide, the official poverty measure, the rate that's used most commonly when we discuss poverty, is not necessarily the most accurate way of measuring economic security in our state. Other measures that are more comprehensive, such as the self-sufficiency standard, do a better job of explaining or of indicating who in our state is struggling to get by and who is doing well. So with that, I'd like to turn now to the state of Colorado after COVID-19. And so this is looking specifically at the period of 2020. And in most cases, our data runs until November 2020, so last month, which is the latest month for which we have much of our employment data that we use in this section of the report. Looking back 20 years, we can get a better sense of just how unprecedented the losses in employment that we experienced as a result of the various public health orders that were put in place earlier in this year. Within a period of 2 months, all of the jobs that we had gained since August 2014 in our state were wiped out. This was not the case during the previous 2 recessions as we look back. We can see that the Great Recession and the 2001 recession experienced job losses and recoveries over a much longer period of time, over a course of years rather than months, as we did this year. Looking now at month-to-month changes in employment throughout 2020, we can see that Colorado lost over 300,000 jobs during March and April. The majority of the losses occurred during the stay-at-home order that was in place during April in our state. May and June also saw record-setting levels of job growth as businesses began to reopen. However, job growth has been tapering off since May, with fewer jobs added in June and even fewer in July. And while we saw stronger job growth in August, employment was okay in September and October, and then we've actually lost around 7,000 jobs, according to preliminary estimates for November. Either way, economists fear that our country has hit its limit and our state has hit its limit in terms of the job growth that's possible, given the current state of public health restrictions on our economy. In other words, we are likely to continue to see weak job numbers, or even some backsliding in terms of employment, losing jobs, unless we are able to drastically contain the spread of COVID-19, either through a contract tracing system while we wait for widespread adoption of the vaccine, before we can safely reopen more of our economy and return to a period of growth, or recovery, I should say, recovery. Comparing changes in employment during this past COVID-19 recession to past recessions, we can see that the magnitude of job losses experienced over the past months was far greater than the losses experienced during the past two recessions. So here we can really see just how significant and sudden those losses were relative to past recessions that we've experienced. Jobs declined and recovered, during past recessions over a period of years, taking anywhere from 50 to 60 months to fully recover the jobs that were lost during the 2001 and Great Recession. This suggests that even when we are able to lift all of the COVID-19 related public health restrictions, it's going to take a number of months, if not years, to fully recover the jobs that we lost this year. And indeed, when we look at other forecasts put out by groups like the Governor's Office or the State Legislative Council, they also predict that we won't return to sort of a normal fiscal situation as a state, at least, until a couple of years from now. Here's how employment was distributed across sectors in February 2020. Obviously, the employment effects, as many of you are probably aware, were felt differently for different sectors of our economy. So it's helpful, I think, to look at the trends and impacts by sector. We can see here that governments employed the most Coloradans in our state. So similar to 2018, had about 460,000 employees as of February 2020. This was followed by healthcare and social assistance in the accommodation and food services sector. On this chart, the red bars represent employment in our state in different sectors as of April 2020, with the white outline portions representing the jobs that were there but had been lost since February. While the greatest losses, and we can see with the largest segment, white segment, was in the accommodation and food services sector, which lost almost 130,000 jobs in the period of 2 months. The losses seen, while those were the greatest, the losses seen in the arts, entertainment, and recreation sector, while smaller, represented about half of the jobs that existed in that sector in February. So, some tremendous impacts when we look at losses in context of the overall size of different sectors in our state. On the other hand, some sectors, such as finance and insurance and information, saw no changes or actually increases in employment over this period. Now, looking at changes since April, job growth is shown in the gold bars on the chart, and we can see that most but not all sectors have gained employment since April. Notably, government, shown in the red crosshatched area, continues to lose jobs, which has been offsetting the gains that we've experienced in other sectors of our economy. The accommodation and food services sector has seen the greatest gains since April, gaining about 88,700 jobs over the course of the summer and the fall. And many sectors of our economy actually have recovered employment and are above employment levels of where they were back in February. However, we still have a number of jobs that we need to gain back before we reach the levels of employment that existed in our state in February. Changes in employment have also varied by wage level. When we use data compiled from different payroll companies that's provided to us from a group called tracktherecovery.org, which is a project by Harvard University, Brown University, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, We can see that while high-wage jobs have almost fully recovered as of October 15th to the levels of employment that existed in January 2020, employment levels for low-wage jobs was still 17.6% lower as of October 15th than it was in January. This is not surprising, given that the majority of job losses were in the accommodation and food services sector, and workers in this sector, on average, had the lowest wages in our state. However, what this does suggest is that those feeling the brunt of job losses, or who have been feeling the brunt of the job losses in our state, are our most vulnerable workers who have the least amount of savings or income on which to fall back on when they did lose their income over the course of this year. So let's take a look at how COVID-19's economic impacts have been felt geographically across our state. This map here shows the number of the percentage of jobs lost in each county between February and April as a share of that county's employment in February. In other words, this is the percent decline in jobs that occurred between February and April. We can see that the greatest losses, relative losses, were experienced in the mountain resort communities, with fewer job losses or rates of decline, slower rates of decline in the eastern parts of the state. In many of the hardest hit counties of our state, more than 1 out of every 5 jobs that was available in February was gone by April. San Miguel County saw the greatest relative decline in jobs, losing 29.2% of its jobs between February and April. On the other hand, Yuma County saw a reduction of jobs of just 8%. So we had tremendous variation across the state. And remember, the statewide rate was 12.2% over this period. The employment situation looks much better as of November. Notably, a number of counties, those shown in yellow, had more jobs in November than they did in February. On the other hand, the mountain resort counties still appear to be lagging other parts of the state in terms of recovery. However, this could be a result of seasonal fluctuations in employment related to ski resorts and winter tourism. It's not uncommon for these counties, mountain resort counties, to actually have lower levels of employment in November than they do in February. And so we'll need to really wait and see how the winter tourism season turns out in many parts of our state before we can make some conclusions about parts of our state that are still struggling versus those that are just experiencing some normal fluctuations. However, these counties are still well below employment levels that they had in February 2020. So as with employment, the recent changes in the unemployment rate was also unprecedented and unlike anything that we've seen in the past 20 years. You can see this by the incredible increase that we see in the chart. During both the 2001 recession and the Great Recession, the unemployment rate in Colorado increased gradually over the course of years rather than over the course of months as it did this year. From a historic low of 2.5% in February 2020, unemployment in our state increased to 12.2% in April, another historic high. The unemployment rate has since dropped to 6.4%, which is still the highest unemployment rate we've seen in our state since October 2013. So better than it was, but still not great. Here's another look at the changes in unemployment rate since January. Again, we can see that the rate peaked in April at 12.2%, and this was higher than the peak that we experienced during the Great Recession, which was 8.9% at its highest during that event. And while the unemployment rate has declined in recent months, or over the summer at least, it's remained level in recent months at 6.4%. So it's remained basically unchanged throughout the months of September to October and October to November. So this is just another indicator that our economic recovery is losing steam. During past recessions, the unemployment rate for males tended to exceed that for females or women workers in our economy. However, this recession has been different in that the female unemployment rate was higher throughout the months of March and April when job losses were greatest. It's even higher if we include the number of women that dropped out of the labor force over this period. In April, the male unemployment rate was 11.0% compared to 14.3% for women. Rates, however, for both men and women have decreased over the summer and are now more or less the same. Unlike gender, the unemployment rate for different racial and ethnic groups in Colorado did trend as we might expect to see during an economic downturn. The unemployment rate for white and non-Hispanic Coloradans tracked very closely with, but below, the statewide rate. This is also what happened when we look at the unemployment rate through previous recessions. However, the rate for Black, Indigenous, and people of color peaked at 17.1% in April, which was nearly 5 percentage points above the statewide rate of 12.2. This is likely due to the overrepresentation of workers of color in sectors that experience the greatest job losses, including accommodation and food services, government, and healthcare and social assistance. However, the unemployment rate for both white and non-white Coloradans converged in the months following July and are now more or less the same. Again, as is typical in past economic downturns, Coloradans with bachelor's degrees or higher experienced the lowest rates of unemployment relative to other Coloradans with lower educational attainment. Even still, the unemployment rate for this group reached 8.3% in April 2020. That said, the unemployment rate for Coloradans with a high school diploma or equivalent and less reached 17.5% that month. Like other groups, the unemployment rate for Coloradans of all educational attainment has declined since June and is converging around the statewide rate. County unemployment rates were highest in April in the western part of the state. No surprise, given the magnitude of job losses that were experienced. And again, no surprise, the unemployment rate was lowest in the eastern part of the states, the counties that experienced the lowest rates of job loss. In April, which is shown on the map here, Pitkin County had the highest unemployment rate in the state at 23.6%, compared to 2.4% unemployment in Cheyenne County, a difference of 21.2 percentage points. So that's quite a spread within our state, a lot of variation depending on where you are. The unemployment rate in every county declined between April and November. The unemployment rate was still highest in San Miguel County, which it was 11.2% in November, or at least preliminary estimates put it at that. And then the lowest rate was seen in Baca County at 2.3%. Counties whose economies are based in tourism generally had higher unemployment rates than others in the state. This was particularly true in the rural resort region, which was the only region in Colorado to have an unemployment rate above the statewide rate. It was 7.2 in November compared to 6.4% statewide. Troublingly, county unemployment rates increased between October and November in all but 10 of Colorado's 64 counties. San Miguel County saw the largest month-to-month increase in its unemployment rate. Between October and November, its unemployment rate increased by 3.3 percentage points, so quite a jump. However, when we look regionally, the Metro Denver region was the only region in the state to see its unemployment rate decline between October and November. As a result of the pandemic, Colorado saw a huge increase in the number of initial unemployment claims filed over this year. The week ending in April 11th saw 104,572 unemployed workers filing initial claims, which was far more, as we can see from the chart, than at any point during the Great Recession. While initial unemployment claims have been declining over the summer, November and December have seen an uptick in initial claims filed in our state. Again, here's a zoomed in look at trends over the past year. Again, we can see that incredible spike that occurred during April in unemployment insurance claims, excuse me. The CARES Act created a number of new unemployment insurance programs that were available for Coloradans. This included the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, or PUA, which extended benefits to classes of workers who are typically ineligible for regular unemployment insurance, such as self-employed workers and gig economy workers. During the week ending in December 19th, the number of unemployed Coloradans who filed initial PUA claims actually exceeded the number of filing initial regular claims. So this program has been very important in assisting out-of-work Coloradans who lost their source of income but had no other program or safety net, such as regular unemployment insurance, that they could turn to. Thankfully, this program was extended as part of the stimulus package that was passed by Congress this past week. And so it will be extended for an additional period beyond this year, because it was set to expire at the end of December. Likewise, the number of Coloradans receiving or waiting for approval of unemployment insurance claims, so those either filing initial claims or filing continued claims, remained high throughout the year. Although the number declined from its peak of 457,727 in early May, it remained fairly steady throughout August, September, and October. As with initial claims, November and December have seen an increase in the number of Coloradans receiving or applying for unemployment insurance benefits. There is many Coloradans receiving unemployment insurance benefits or applying for benefits during the week of December 5th, as there were during the week of, than there were at the end of September. And so we sort of moved backwards in terms of the progress that we made over the fall in reducing the number of people on receiving unemployment insurance. There are a number of reasons why workers may file a continued unemployment insurance claim or choose to remain on unemployment insurance. Some may be unable to find work. Others may be unable to find work that they feel is safe for themselves because they are either susceptible to COVID-19, contracting the disease or dying from it, or they live with someone who could be susceptible to COVID-19. Still others may be taking a wait and see approach and waiting to see sort of what happens for fear that if they go off on unemployment insurance and receive get a new job, that job might be gone in a week and they'll have to go back through the whole onerous process of applying for and receiving unemployment insurance benefits. In the meantime, they'll be out without a source of income. So unemployed Coloradans in our state can receive unemployment insurance benefits for 26 weeks. If they're still unemployed at the end of this period, then they qualify for what's known as Pandemic Emergency Unemployment Compensation. And this was another program that was created as part of the CARES Act to extend regular unemployment insurance benefits for an additional 13 weeks. Following the end of this period, unemployed Coloradans qualify for an additional 13 weeks of unemployment insurance through what's called state extended benefits. And as of December 5th, there were approximately 74,000 Coloradans receiving PEUC, meaning 74,000 Coloradans had exhausted their regular unemployment insurance benefits. This was down slightly from the week before, but still much higher than in previous months. Approximately 23.8% of Colorado workers who received or were applying for unemployment insurance received PEUC the week ending in December 5th. A small but growing number of Coloradans have also exhausted their PEUC benefits and are now receiving state extended benefits. So this suggests that many Coloradans have been unable to find unemployment before their regular benefits were exhausted, and that these programs remained essential in order to support out-of-work Coloradans in our state. Luckily, again, as with PUA, the PEUC program was extended through the new stimulus package that was passed by Congress. It was, again, set to expire at the end of this month. So these supports will continue to be available for Coloradans who are out of work in our state. So that's all we have for the period following COVID-19, so the period for 2020. Again, I just want to go over quickly some key takeaways from this data before we jump into the question and answer portion of the presentation. So my first takeaway, the big one, is that this recession does not look like past recessions. There's a number of ways in which this is the case, both in terms of the magnitude and the quickness with which we lost and have regained jobs. Also in terms of the number of people that were unemployed, the share of unemployed Coloradans in our state was much higher than previous recessions. And the industries that were impacted were different. Primarily low-wage industries were impacted most in our state, whereas in previous recessions, it's been middle and high-wage jobs that have seen the greatest impacts. The job losses that we did experience in our state were particularly bad for workers in the hospitality and leisure sectors, so accommodation and food services and arts, entertainment, and recreation. Unemployment insurance, particularly the extended weekly benefits that expired in July. If you remember back, those were the additional $600 weekly benefits that folks who were receiving regular unemployment insurance benefits received in addition to. And this was, these programs were and still are lifesavers for many Coloradans, as well as our economy. I think many people don't think about unemployment insurance as a stimulus program, but it actually is. It does create a huge amount of spending and injects a huge amount of dollars into our economy. Looking just at the period for which the PEUC, or the extended $600 benefits, were available in our state, it added an estimated close to $2 billion in economic new dollars into our state during a period where many Coloradans were losing their jobs and their sources of income. So not only does it allow Coloradans to support themselves and their families when they lose their job, but it also allows them to spend money in the local economy, stimulating additional economic activity. The jobs lost in some industries might not come back for a while, if at all. We saw this happen during the last recession, where some sectors did not recover all of the jobs that they had lost. And the question, I think this raises a question of what do we do with workers who are depending or sort of only qualified for jobs in certain industries if those industries don't see recovery like other industries do? How can we help them recover, or how can we help them transition into new industries? So we can see, looking back at jobs data for the past month, for the past year, that jobs have been coming back and were coming back in record numbers at the beginning of the summer, but our recovery appears to be losing steam. Hopefully, this will sort of turn around as more money is pumped into our economy through the new stimulus package that was passed by Congress, but we'll have to wait and see. And I think overall, until we're able to manage the spread of COVID-19 through a vaccine or some other way, that we aren't going to be able to, that our economy isn't going to be able to fully recover. And so, luckily, vaccines have been approved and are in distribution currently. However, it will be a number of months before, enough folks in our state are vaccinated before we can safely lift some of the public health restrictions on our economy. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for tuning in and joining us today. I hope that that was interesting and informative, that everyone learned something new. And I'm here and available for you now for some questions.
Thanks, Charlie. That was both interesting and informative. A lot of information packed into a short amount of time there. So thank you.
Even more in the report. So.
Oh, absolutely. Having read the report, I can attest to that. Good stuff. We have quite a few questions here. And those of you out there in Zoom land, feel free to submit any additional questions through the Q&A feature in your Zoom toolbox. I see a few on chat as well. Charlie, I will forewarn you, these are not softball questions. Some of these are actually pretty hard. So I'll start with what I think is the easy one first, and then we'll move up. And if you feel you need some reinforcements, just let me know. I can answer some of these questions as well. Some of them are actually outside of the report.
And I also just say, I think a lot of the trends, the main purpose of the report was mostly just to capture trends in different, statistics. And so for a lot of them, we still don't necessarily know the reasons why, certain geographic trends exist, or sort of, or geographic disparities exist in our state, or the why behind a lot of these reasons. And so, I can try to answer some of them, but for a lot of them, this was mostly just a jumping off point, both for us and for other groups in the state to use as a resource as we sort of dive into sort of more detailed questions about our economy, trying to answer some answers, right, questions that we don't know the answers to.
We know a lot, but sometimes we don't know what we don't know.
Yeah.
The first question is from Patrice Hawkins. And she said she believed the slide moved too quickly on the percentage of labor force that are people of color in 2018. Of the people of color in Colorado in general, what percentage are employed, or is there a disproportionate unemployment for this group?
So there is actually, and so I'll go back to, I've got two slides. We've got the one that we covered in the presentation, which we can see, oops, sorry, that's by education, wrong one. This one by labor force. So the labor force in these slides, it includes both Coloradans who are employed, but also Coloradans who are unemployed in government statistics. And so it's sort of both the combination of people who are or who have work or are looking for work. And one that we didn't show that I have here that I can pull out is the historical trends in unemployment rate by race. And so we can see that, over the course of the past 18 years or so, the unemployment rate for both Black and Hispanic Coloradans tended to be higher than the statewide rate. And so non-white Coloradans do tend to be unemployed at unemployed at higher rates than white Coloradans as a whole. Now, there's obviously some variations in those trends, and we saw that in sort of the data from 2020. But by and large, there is a gap between Coloradans of color and the statewide average or statewide unemployment rate.
Right. I have a few from an anonymous attendee. One is, do you have any data on how COVID has impacted older workers in Colorado? News reports say they're not getting hired back as much as younger workers. I've heard that anecdotally as well. Do you have any insights on that?
So there is data available on that, but we did not look at it as part of this report. So, it is possible using estimates from the current population survey to track unemployment rate by different age groups. And so, that could very well be the case, but we don't have any data in the report to support that either way. Okay. Or disprove it, I should say, as well. So.
We have another anonymous attendee. What has been the impact of direct dollar payments versus continuous unemployment payments? Can you take a crack at that?
Yeah, and actually this question came up during the most recent talks about the congressional stimulus package. At one point it sounded like, we might get either one or the other, direct payments or increased unemployment insurance benefits. And I think the answer is quite, it depends, and there are different impacts on, on different groups. And so, the impacts really depend on, perhaps the group that you're intending to target. Because those direct payments, the stimulus payments that we got back in April or May, in the spring sometime, and the ones that it looks like we will be getting, those go out to everyone or nearly everyone. I should say everyone that's an American citizen who paid taxes last year and has a Social Security number. It looks like and so, that's really helping both people that may not have any work or people that are able to remain employed. Whereas the additional unemployment insurance benefits really targeted people that had lost their source of income and had no other sort of source of income or way to provide for themselves and their families. And so I think the impacts are different, and so it's hard to compare which one is better than the other. Both were tremendous, stimulus measures. I think, some evidence or research that I've seen indicates that, unlike the unemployment insurance payments, a lot more people used their stimulus payments, those direct checks, to pay off debts rather than to spend. And so if that's the case, then it might not necessarily have the same stimulatory effect as it did for folks who were depending on expanded unemployment insurance benefits as their source of income. And so, I think another way to think about this is also trying to understand, acknowledging that, the way that people spend money does have different impacts in terms of stimulating economic activity. If that money goes primarily to savings and paying off debts, then it has less of an impact than it does if folks were spending that directly in the economy.
Okay. I have a question from an anonymous attendee, and it's a variation on a question that was asked earlier, but over the last 3 years, which state and or federal policies have had the most impact on those living below the poverty line?
Sure. So actually, this is measured by the Census Bureau. And so what we looked at was known as the official poverty measure, which is just looking at, income before taxes and transfer payments are factored in, compared to sort of that threshold that's set by the federal government. And so there's another measure that the Census Bureau actually puts out, which is called the Supplemental Poverty Measure, or the SPM. And that takes into account different programs that are designed both to alleviate poverty, so things, or ones that just do involve some sort of transfer of income or redistribution of income among different households. So this is primarily looking at, after-tax income. How do different social programs in the country influence poverty? And so what we do know is that these do have an impact. So the supplemental poverty measure is actually lower than the official poverty measure is. And one of the main programs in our state and in the country that is it has been shown to have the greatest impact on reducing the poverty rate across the board is the Earned Income Tax Credit. So the EITC, there's both a federal EITC and a state EITC here in Colorado. And actually, during the past legislative session, CCLP, along with many other partners, were involved in efforts to increase the amount of the state level EITC. And so, that is really a program that everyone qualifies for if they meet the income requirements. You do it through your taxes, and it's a credit that goes that's paid towards or credited to you against your tax bill if you have one. And it really is sort of the most direct transfer of payments that we have, sort of across the board for all taxpayers in our country. And so it does tend to have the largest effect on alleviating poverty.
Right. And I think we should mention too that last session, the legislature passed House Bill 1420, which closed and modified tax breaks that favored the wealthiest Coloradans to backfill education budget for the next 2 years and expand the ITC. So that was a positive step forward.
Yep. So for those that don't know, we have the federal EITC, and then the state EITC is a match. So it's just a certain percent of the federal EITC you get from the state of Colorado on your state tax bill. And so that that share, percentage of the federal tax credit that you receive was increased as a result of that bill. Yep. Thanks, Bob.
Sure. Do you know if we have a hard stop at 12 o'clock today, Charlie? Because we may want to wind down or take one more question.
We could probably take a couple more. I don't have a hard stop, but if others do, this will be posted in the video that we post online. So you can always go back and hear some questions that you missed if you don't have time to stick around.
Well, even if we don't have a hard stop, does our Zoom account have a hard stop?
Oh, it shouldn't. I don't think it does, but we might all get cut off here in a sec. So if we do, that's why.
We have a question here from Don Burns, the co-founder of the Burns, it's Burns Institute, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Hi, Bob.
Major. He wanted to know, do you have any data on the numbers of people experiencing homelessness who are employed? And if so, has this changed because of the pandemic?
So we don't, and we didn't include those in the report. That certainly is something that I think that we'll probably want to look more into as we develop those white papers that Tiffany had mentioned, just because, I think, we have seen a growing number of individuals who are experiencing homelessness in our state. And so, I think understanding the impacts that COVID-19 had on our state includes understanding the impacts that it had on that population. I have not seen any information yet about sort of how many folks who are experiencing homelessness in our state are working and how that's changed over the course of this year, but certainly something that, I think we'd be interested in looking into in the future.
Okay. And we have one more question that I could answer easily. It's from Melissa Ordelheid. Hope I pronounced that correctly, but she asked, can someone post a link to the report? We actually do have that posted on our website right now at cclponline.org. If you go in there under publications, the very top item is State of Working Colorado 2020 report. That will lead you to a link of the report. We've also sent out a news release much earlier this morning, which contains a direct link to the report. It is some pretty heavy reading there. What, 132 pages, Charlie?
Yeah, I will say a lot of that is taken up by nice charts and graphs and maps. So if you like pictures, hopefully it should be an easy read. And if you want to get more information about what the charts are showing, you can sort of look at those sections within the report. So if you don't have time to read the whole thing, which I'm a data nerd, so I definitely would do something like that. But if others aren't like me, we do have it divided up into different sections as well, so you can sort of focus in on a particular topic that's of interest to you.
Well, it's an excellent report. Great charts, great information, great analysis.